leave to it, shall I?
Fantastic, yes. Hello everybody. My name is Abby. I'm from Precision Hydration. I'm the sports scientist with Precision Hydration. Anyone familiar with the brand Precision Hydration? Anyone heard of us before? A few hands up. Yeah, we've donated a few goodies today, so if you weren't familiar before, hopefully you'll be familiar soon. But a quick brief background to what Precision Hydration does. We do personalised hydration, so we try to individualise your hydration to an athlete and their needs, rather than sort of saying one size fits all approach. Rather than saying here's an electrolyte drink, off you go, we try and tailor what an athlete needs with what they're replacing. And I'm going to come back to that in a moment and cover that in a bit more detail, and hopefully that will become clear exactly what I mean by that. But just briefly, what we really specifically do, the basis of the company, where it started, was with sweat testing. Now, when I first started with Precision Hydration, I used to tell people that I was a sweat tester, and then I'd get some really funny looks and some really funny questions, so I stopped saying that. I just go with sports scientist because it's far easier. But fundamentally what we have the patent to a piece of equipment that induces an athlete to start sweating on their forearm. We collect the sweat and we analyse it for how much sodium they lose in their sweat. So we measure their sweat sodium concentration. And that's a really interesting measure because it differs between individuals. Some people are not so salty and they don't lose that much salt in their sweat, and some people are super salty. And you might be sat there completely dumbfounded by that, or you might be sat there thinking, actually that's kind of relevant. I've felt, crusty, horrible word, it's a horrible word, when I've dried off after exercise, or you might see white marks on clothing, or you might feel it sting in your eyes, or you might have even tasted it. So that's kind of a sign that you might be someone that sits on the higher end of the continuum, and that's one factor that I'm going to come back to. But most of my talk, and I promise I won't witter on for too long, but I've been asked to talk about fueling and hydration to optimise endurance performance. And when we talk about this at Precision Hydration, we talk about it in the context of the 3 levers approach. Now, what this entails, we say that when you're doing endurance performance, there's 3 sort of acute costs to that exercise, 3 things that you're losing, and therefore 3 things that you need to be replacing. Now, if I gave you all sort of a minute or two, I'm sure that people could probably shout out those 3 things. One I've probably already given to you, and I'm sure you could get the other 2, but to save time, I'm going to give them to you. So the first lever is sort of calories and energy, mainly in the form of carbohydrates, and I'll talk briefly about why it's carbohydrates and not fat, for example. Lever 2 is fluids, so mainly lost as sweat, and lever 3 is sodium, again mainly lost in sweat or salt. We use the terms interchangeably, although they are a little bit different. So there are other important sort of nutritional practices around optimising performance, but we feel that these 3 are kind of a head and shoulders above the other 3 and worth a bit more time. You get these 3 right, you get the replacement right in roughly the right magnitude relative to your losses, and you're going to be doing a lot better than if you're someone that ignores it completely or just wings it, which happens a lot. We see a lot of athletes that are happy to wing it until it goes horribly wrong one day, and then they seek us out for some help. So starting with lever 1, carbohydrates, let's talk a little bit about them. Why carbohydrates and not fat or other nutritional strategies? Carbohydrates, when we're talking about optimising performance, are definitely king. There's a wealth of evidence behind that, mainly being that carbohydrates are your most efficient fuel for the body to use when exercise intensity is moderate or higher, so when we're working hard. And that's because it takes less oxygen to break carbohydrate down into ATP, which is the energy molecule in the body, versus fat. So fat needs a lot more oxygen. And of course, when we're working hard, we all know that we start breathing heavier. Oxygen demand or oxygen supply becomes a little bit less. And so carbohydrate is far more efficient to be broken down into. So the question around carbohydrate and that lever 1 is, how much should I be taking? How much should I be fueling? What's the optimal amount for me? Well, it does depend, the answer to that question. It does depend on the person. What is it that you're doing? What intensity, what duration? How familiar are you with taking carbohydrates? What's the goal of that exercise? Is it a recovery ride or are you racing? That makes a difference. But we can put sort of some numbers on it, some rough numbers. Anything sort of less than an hour, you probably don't need to be fueling. You don't need to take in any carbohydrates if you're starting well fueled, and that's because we've got good stores of glycogen in the muscles already, and that's going to carry you through that hour of exercise. Once you start stepping into sort of 90 minutes, 2 hours, 3 hours, similar to what you've all done today, it becomes beneficial to start fueling and start intaking some form of carbohydrate. And that's because those glycogen stores are beginning to run out at that stage. Now, how much? To put a number on it, roughly sort of between 30 to 60 grams per hour is sufficient. And that might look like 500 ml of your standard sort of isotonic sports drink, or 1 to 2 sort of standard energy gels. Now, I don't know if anyone's found them yet in the bag, but everyone should have in your goodie bag a gel from us. It's a Pf30 gel, so these are our new product, brand new. These are actually not yet released, so you're one of the first people to get your hands on these. They've only gone on pre-order this week, so people haven't got their hands on them yet. This has 30 grams of calories in, 30 grams of carb, and so 1 to 2 of these per hour would sort of see you through that 2 to 3 hour kind of ride. Once you step up beyond that kind of 3 hour duration, 3, 4 further, sort of that ultra zone, we might advise an athlete to start fueling a little bit more if the intensity is high, and we might say 60 to 90 grams. Just to be mindful, 90 grams of carb per hour is a pretty substantial amount of fuel, and not a lot of athletes would be able to intake that right off the bat. They would build up to that level, and so you definitely undergo some kind of sort of gut training in order to achieve that level of carbohydrate intake, especially if you're someone that is prone to suffering GI distress or issues in the past. Now, lever 2, fluids. So carbohydrates are quite great because once you've zoned in on the number, they tend to stay relatively stable. Fluids are a bit more variable on your fluid intake and how much you should be replacing, and that's because fluid intake and your requirement is based on your sweat rate, and sweat rate is a very variable factor. I'm sure we can all sit here and sort of relate to that. If we're exercising in the winter, we might not be sweating that much, you know, you might not even feel a drop on you. Exercising in the summer today, anyone get sweaty out there? Yeah? Hotter. So sweat rate is very variable, both between individuals, but also within an individual. And that can be because of environmental factors, but also airflow, the clothing that we're wearing, how hard we're going for, the duration. So all these factors mean that the amount that we're sweating can really vary day to day, and therefore the amount of fluid that we should be putting back in can vary as well. So it's a little bit harder to put numbers on how much fluid an athlete should be taking. But again, to put some sort of generic guidelines and to calibrate your thinking, anything less than an hour, again, you perhaps might not need fluids, particularly if it's cool or if it's not a hard ride. If you want fluids, by all means drink if you fancy them, but they may not be necessary. Once that duration becomes longer and we're again 2-3 hours into a ride, it becomes really beneficial to performance to be taking some fluids in if you're sweating. And that's because if you sweat and you don't replace any fluids, then you're going to slowly dehydrate. And dehydration, the best way I can describe to imagine dehydration is a constriction of your blood plasma volume. So the amount of blood you've got pumping around the body reduces because sweat is drawn from the blood. And blood, of course, supplies the muscles with oxygen. So in order to maintain performance, you want to continue supplying them with the same amount of blood. As you dehydrate, there's less blood to meet that demand, and the heart rate has to, or the heart and lungs have to work harder, have to beat faster to meet that demand. Now that's made worse in the heat, not one because you're probably sweating more, so dehydrating faster, but also your core body temperature is rising and the body wants to keep itself cool, and in order to do that, it sweats. So it's diverting that blood flow to the skin as well. Now suddenly you've got this competition going on in the body between the muscles and the skin. You've got this greater demand and the body's trying to keep up with both, so again the heart rate jumps even higher, but of course there's a limit to that. So once the heart rate kind of maxes out, then that's when performance is going to drop off. So hydration, really key. Keeping well hydrated will maintain that blood plasma volume, reduce that cardiovascular strain, and you won't see that drift up in heart rate quite so severely. In terms of fluid amounts, as I said, it's very variable. It's quite hard to put numbers on, but for most people, somewhere between 500 ml and a litre per hour is sort of a sensible guideline. But what we would do with an athlete is we would work with them, we'd talk about their sweat rate, understand their losses, build kind of a framework, so we call it guardrails, for them to then go and do some trial and error and work within, and then based on sort of instinct, feel and experience, they would know how to adjust that fluid intake based on trial and error. So a really key part of the equation that perhaps people don't like, because athletes love to be told exactly what to do and they love numbers, but with fluid it's a little bit difficult to do that. Lever 3, third one, sodium. I'm nearly there. Sodium is the main electrolyte lost in sweat, so that's why we are interested in it. You do lose other electrolytes in the sweat, sort of minor electrolytes like calcium, magnesium, potassium, and people love to talk to me about those ones, but they're not as important in terms of fluid balance in the body, because that's sodium's role. Sodium and fluid are balanced in the body. They work as a pair. And sodium is, as I said at the start of this talk, our losses differ between athletes. Some people are not so salty and some people are super salty. For no real rhyme or reason other than genetics, it is what it is. Some people are salty and some people aren't. And what we have to do is we have to couple that sweat sodium concentration with an athlete's sweat rate to work out their net sodium loss. So sweat rate, if you're a really sweaty person, can act as a multiplying factor on that number. So if I was to sweat test each and every one of you in here, and then we were to add in your sweat rate, we would get a big old continuum of losses. So everyone loses different amounts, and that's where our products then come in with our different strength electrolyte drinks. In your goodie bags, you've each received a tube of our Ph30 drink. That's kind of our moderate to high strength electrolyte drink. From all the thousands of sweat tests that we've done, we know that on average an athlete loses around 950 to 1,000 milligrams of sodium per litre of sweat. We've tested people as low as 200 and as high as 2,000. So there's like a tenfold difference between people. But on average, most people fall in this middle of the continuum. And that's why we've given you the 1,000, because generally it's the most applicable strength for most scenarios. We do have a lower strength electrolyte and a higher strength electrolyte to meet the needs of everyone along that continuum. So when describing this, we like to use the analogy of like t-shirt size. If you go shopping and you're trying to get a t-shirt, you know if you're a small, medium, large or extra large, and if you're a large, you want to go and pick up a large rather than a small, right? And the same is with electrolytes. If you're large, if your losses are large, why would we give you a small? You know, it's only replacing a small proportion of your losses, and ultimately over several hours, what's not a problem sort of an hour, 90 minutes into exercise can become quite a big problem as that deficit multiplies hour upon hour. So everyone is different, and we try to cater for that. And I'm going to wrap it up there because I have been talking for quite a long time, but if anyone has any questions, please feel free to fire away and I'll do my best to answer them.
Just tell us how much the sweat testing costs.
On average in the UK, the sweat test is about £95. It does differ depending on location. So we have a number of sweat test centres around the UK, and they each, generally it's £95, but it does differ a little bit.
You've got a quiz on your website, haven't you?
Yes. Lovely. Did we plant you? We have on our website an online questionnaire. It's 10 questions. Everyone that's done the advanced sweat test has done this questionnaire. And as I said, we've done thousands of tests now. So we had that data, that online questionnaire data, analysed at Sheffield Hallam University. And they found that the questionnaire asked you questions, your perceived salt losses and your perceived sweat rate and any issues with cramping and what it is that you do. And we've seen correlations between what people think they lose and what they actually lose. So it's a pretty good indicator of what your losses are. It places you nicely along that continuum. It's a rough guide, but it's a really good cornerstone to start trial and erroring from. Yes, great question, thank you.
Question on overhydrating.
Overhydrating. It is an issue.
This is someone I drink quite a lot. I can get through a litre an hour.
Yeah.
And I worry, am I doing something bad as well with that?
Possibly. Are you drinking to thirst, or is it a conscious thing to drink that much?
To thirst.
Yeah.
I mean, yeah, I feel thirsty a lot of the time, and I'm worried about being dehydrated. So then I drink a lot, and then I have to wee a lot. Then I'm like, am I just drinking weeing? But am I diluting my electrolytes and contributing to cramping as well, potentially?
This is a great question. Did they send out information beforehand or something? A crib sheet? Overhydrating is a big problem because the message, sort of 10, 20 years ago for athletes was drink, drink, drink. We needed to stay really well hydrated all the time, but people were drinking lots of plain water or water very low in electrolytes. And you can, as you've pointed out, dilute the blood sodium levels. And if that's taken to an extreme, and it is an extreme I'm talking about here, you can sort of predispose yourself to a condition called hyponatremia. So hyponatremia, hypo meaning low, natremia being like the scientific term for sodium, low blood sodium levels essentially. You're diluting the sodium levels in the blood, and then you're peeing it out, and you lose electrolyte through your urine as well, and you put yourself on the back foot. And this is really common for athletes to do ahead of races. They start to panic. They've checked the weather for their race at the weekend. It's going to be really warm. They start guzzling water days in advance, which they never do prior to any training. But come race day, God, I've got to be really well hydrated, and they set themselves on the back foot, because I always describe it as the body's fluid and sodium balance in the body. So let's say sodium's on the left here and fluid's on the right. You drink too much plain water and you're just diluting the body's sodium levels, and then you find yourself in the queue for the toilet and you pee it all out and you lose a few more electrolytes, and you're starting on the back foot. Low sodium, low fluid, the two things you're about to go and sweat out for hour upon hour. So our highest strength electrolyte drink, our Ph1500, which is a purple tube, right there, oh my God, is not only a strength that people can use during, but is our preloading strength as well. So we would advise athletes to have a tablet the night before and one the morning of, with the idea being that you have a high strength sodium drink and create an imbalance this way, put a bit more sodium into the body. The body doesn't want to make that balance any worse by getting rid of its water. The body loves balance and will always try to maintain balance, so the body retains fluid better. And you can think of that as water follows salt. And so you start with this sort of greater buffer of sodium and fluid. Again, the two things that you're about to go sweat out. So you're starting with your best foot forward, really. But yes, sorry, back to the question, you can overhydrate, but typically if people are drinking to thirst, if they're drinking sensibly, if you're thirsty for that fluid, the body is telling you what it needs and what it wants, so it's probably not an issue. If you do feel that you're urinating excessively, then possibly tone it back a little bit, or add some electrolytes to those fluids and help the body retain it a bit better. Any other questions?
What about getting it in through your food?
Yes.
If you have a bag of crisps or something.
It's a great point. So anything sort of less than 90 minutes of exercise, you probably can leave the electrolytes on the shelf, because although you'll be sweating and you'll be losing some, you won't create a deficit big enough that the foods you eat after exercise in your recovery meal or snack aren't going to, cancel that out. So you're totally right. Most people consume enough sodium in their diets to cover moderate exercise. We're really talking about endurance exercise, people that are out in the heat, driving high sweat losses, sweating for 2, 3, 4, 5 hours, at which point replacement becomes necessary.
Can you take too many electrolytes? So if you were to take the highest amount that you do, but actually physically you'd only need the lower one, would that make a difference, or would you just pee it out?
You would just pee it out. You can take too much of any nutrient. So we get asked, can you overdose on sodium? It's a question we get loads, and the right answer is yes, because you can take too much of anything if you aggressively try to. But can you take too much of a sports drink? It would be really hard. Should everyone be using the Ph1500 strength? No. It's about 3 times as salty as your average electrolyte tablet, which is great for people that have really high salt losses, but isn't needed by everyone. There's a reason that we have the range. Some people are down here and some people are up here. If you take the 1500 when you don't need it, you'll probably feel a bit thirstier. And that's the body saying drink some plain water. And again, it comes back to that balance. It's the body trying to bring its balance back in line and even the scales. So you'll probably just feel a bit thirsty and you will just wee them out and you want to drink some plain water.
Great. So much information on hydration. It's incredible how much there is. If anyone wants to find out any more information, Abby, where
the
can they head
website. The website, which I think some people have been on, www.precisionhydration.com. And if anyone has any questions, walks away and think, oh, I should have asked that, you can reach us on email at hello@precisionhydration.com and you'll get a real human. It might even be me, or it might be my lovely colleagues JP and Greg, but you'll get one of us.
And on there you can also find the places where you can do the sweat tests and different locations on there.
Exactly, yeah, where you can do the sweat test. You've got the online sweat test. We've got a carb calculator coming, so the energy gels that you've got is the start of fueling ranges. So yeah, lots of exciting stuff, so go and check it out.
Yeah, so informative, it's incredibly. And also the DHB ambassadors. Thank you very much, Abby, that was brilliant, thank you.